Geoffrey Winthrop-Young.
Well, thanks to Dan and to Anne for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in what several independent sources have told me is the best audience in Vancouver, here to talk a bit about Peter Sloterdijk. Now, if Sloterdijk himself were here, which would make this a far more memorable evening, trust me, one of the first things he would point out is the mismatch between speaker and venue. Dan has informed me that the Vancouver Institute for Social Research is named after the New York Institute for Social Research, which of course is the English translation of the Frankfurt Institute for Sozialforschung, which, as many of you know, and some of you know very well, was founded almost exactly 100 years ago, funded by some rich industrialists who gave money to their sons, who then developed very, very critical theories about the injustice of society, which allowed their fathers to make so much money. And out of this, of course, came the famous Frankfurt School, which, in an even more famous op-ed or letter in August 1999, Peter Sloterdijk declared dead. As a matter of fact, he said, "It is a bedridden old broad and she is finally croaked." This particular death wish is, of course, linked, one, to the alleged campaign that was waged against him by the greatest living proponent of the Frankfurt School, that is Jürgen Habermas, but it also, on a deeper level, it speaks of the fundamental difference in attitude, Stimmung, mood, and attunement between the Frankfurt School and what Sloterdijk is proposing. So, hear ye have invited the enemy. What I will do is, I think I'm not the first to do this, I will speak without a script and without notes. This is risky because it always comes with the danger of ad hoc and in the heat of the moment distortions and exaggerations and misrepresentations, but I'm pretty certain that Sloterdijk can handle it. For there is no philosopher in the history of philosophy who is so invested in the art of exaggeration than Sloterdijk himself, who after all has written very persuasively about the fact that philosophy originated in a school of exaggeration. When Plato and his minions met in a grove dedicated to a very minor deity, a puny demigod called Academus, and became academicians, they were modeling their behavior on professional athletes. As athletes exaggerate feats of the body, philosophers exaggerate feats of the mind. And what Sloterdijk does is, he's in a way, in a chemical point of view, a highly reactive philosopher. The moment he runs into something else, like sodium in counting water, he starts foaming. And this I will do too in the oral engagement with some of the basic ideas of Sloterdijk. What I will do is the following. I will start, as in a good 007 movie, with a teaser that has very little to do with the narrative, that sets the stage. I will then make a few biographical remarks which are not there to explain Sloterdijk, but because they have certain heuristic value. I will then, in about 10 minutes, give a summary of the 3,000 pages of Spheres, which may or may not involve some shortcuts, and I will then end with a couple of comments on terror from the air. Recall, please, that this text, Luftbeben, which literally translates as earthquakes or earth trembling, first was published on his own, but then appeared as an initial chapter in the 3rd volume of Spheres, of which so far only the 1st volume has been published, the 2nd volume is in the works for next year, and the 3rd volume somewhere down the road. So let me start with a kind of a teaser, which no doubt will strike you as extremely narcissistic and self-indulgent, because I will be talking about something which has got no relevance to Sloterdijk whatsoever, and that is my family history. But just hear me out, I hope I can make a point. As those of you who have read the text know, the 22nd of April 1915, with the first successful, that is military language for deadly, gas attack in the history of warfare, occurred at the Battle of Ypres, to be precise, the Second Battle of Ypres. Please keep in mind that we are at the heart of several national memory productions here. This is a very powerful lieu de mémoire. Within 10 days of the attack, John McCrae will write in Flanders Field. Ypres is within a stone's throw of Passchendaele, which will be as important during the Third Battle of Ypres for English national memory as the other township very close to Ypres, Langemarck, was for the First Battle of Ypres for the Germans. Now, my grandfather was in Ypres from roughly November 1914 to August 1915 in a fairly prominent position, because he had organized the hospital units in Ypres. So he was basically the man responsible for bringing the people back from the trenches into Ypres and then out again to the trenches. And Ypres was a bit like Leningrad in the Second World War, kind of a salient, almost surrounded by German troops. And so the city was decaying day by day. And being there on the 22nd of April, he was not a victim of the first gas attack, but he was a witness of the first victims. 40 years later, after the Second World War, he wrote in his memoirs this: "The wounded began to pour in, the first poison gas sufferers. This horror was too monstrous to believe at first. But when it came, far as we had travelled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth, lying on the floor and out on the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind by the hideous concentration camps in later Germany, ever quite rekindled. For back then we still thought that all men were human." Now, unless you are into the history of mountaineering, there's absolutely no reason why you should know my grandfather, so don't have a bad conscience about that. But maybe one or two of you recollect the quote, because it was displayed with great effect, I think, in the recent very magnificent study of George Mallory by Wade Davis. And the reason why the quote in there is first, because my grandfather happened to be Mallory's mountaineering mentor, and second, because this quote, with its Wilfred Owen George Sassoon connotations, in a way drives home the basic point that Davis was trying to make in his book. It is only the constant exposure to the death zones of the First World War, it is only the constant carnage which made people ready to climb Everest. The exposure to the death zone there made them willing to go up into another death zone. From Sloterdijk's point of view, this can be supported with a very nifty argument. The move from the lowlands of Belgium to the highlands of the Himalaya is the move from the gas mask to the oxygen mask. It is the move from one area where the most important enabling environment, air, has been destroyed, to one into which you have to import air in order to survive. And this is, of course, the basic theory behind this text and of Spears itself, that modernism is bookended by two approaches to what he calls air conditioning. That is the attack on your enabling environment, that is atmoterrorism, and air conditioning, which is the creation, the conscious creation of livable zones based on the now understanding of how air works. What connects the two is the term explication, or, as Bruno Latour calls it, and that is the term Sloterdijk himself uses when he speaks in English, explicitation, more of which later. Now, after this double scare 7 teaser, let's get into Sloterdijk himself a bit. Sloterdijk is born in 1947. He is the son of a Dutch sailor who somehow ended up at the end of the war down in southwestern Germany in the Karlsruhe area where Sloterdijk is born, where he met his mother. It was, by all accounts, a very unsuccessful marriage. There was not only different backgrounds, there was also different class, different levels of culture. Sloterdijk, who claims that he remembers very little of his early childhood, says that the first serious talk he remembers among his parents was when they decided to divorce. Now, first, very trivial point, but one which does explain Sloterdijk a bit. growing up in Karlsruhe and in Munich with the very Dutch and very un-German name Sloterdijk already puts you in an outsider's position. Number two, it is the absence of the father who is not really there and who then completely disappears. Please recall that he's born 1947, and that makes him one of the members of the core cohort of the student movement, of what in German is called the 68er, the 68ers. Now, as you all know, I don't need to go into any detail because we all know this well, the conventional explanation of the student movements and of the uprisings, of the insurgencies and the cultural revolutions of the 1960s is that one constituent component was this revolt against paternal authority, epitomized by the far too old politicians of the post-war area, Eisenhower in the States, Adenauer in Germany, de Gaulle in France, and whoever came after it in the 60s. What is important to realize is also, and this is well known, is that this takes on a specifically strong aspect in Germany, where the uprising against the father's generation is an uprising against the generations, against people who had been part of the Third Reich. Be it as perpetrators, be it as fellow travelers, or be it as people who did not open their mouth. Now comes the extra twist. These were also the people who had lost the war. So in the more radical interpretation by some cultural theorists, especially the historian Götz Ali, it is not the uprising against a long-established paternal authority, it is the uprising against the paternal authority that had lost its authority because it lost the war, with many absent fathers in Soviet captivity. More importantly, and more to the point, you can say it is not an uprising against authority, it is the attempt to install authority where the fathers had failed. That is encompassed in the highly polemical title of Ali's book, Unser Kampf, Our Struggle, with its obvious relationship to Mein Kampf. And Ali runs through a lot of arguments saying that nobody is more like the students of the 1960s than the students of the 1930s. Look at it. The hatred for all alienated or systemic or too economically or too materialistically organized society, the craving for authentic organic communities, this very, very ambiguous relationship to the United States, and also in the 1960s, a streak of anti-Semitism. This is one of the reasons why Sloterdijk himself is a bit of an oddball in this particular constellation. He belongs to that part of the student movement which did not go strongly into the political domain, but more into the cultural theoretical and the existential domain. And then, this is well known, and he's ridiculed for this until this day, in the late 70s, early 80s, he went to India, to Pune, to be a follower of the Bhagwan, who in those days, especially in the German press, was ridiculed a lot. He was basically on an L. Ron Hubbard level, although in reality he was not. But you have then something very strange. In my opinion, there are three German theorists who came of this unrest who are worth reading. Klaus Teweleit, Friedrich Kittler, and Peter Sloterdijk. And of these three, only one, Teweleit, author of Male Fantasies, is clearly located where you would expect it to be located, namely on the political left, whereas the other two are not. As a matter of fact, in recent publications, Sloterdijk has been accused as being an unwitting spokesman for the new right in Germany, coming up with stuff which you would hear, although not so sophisticatedly formulated, from the American Tea Party. Keep this in mind then, that we're dealing with somebody who is very much both a manifestation and going against the great uprisings and the great liberation moments of his youth. And now let us look at the great argument he develops in Spheres, which is the background to the small excerpt on gas war and air conditioning. Now, as I said, I'm unable to summarize, I think it is 3,000 pages in densely written German within a couple of minutes, unless you want to stay here until 3 in the morning. This is how it works. Think of this as the Amazon jungle. And like the Amazon jungle, it is arranged in ecosystems that are on top of each other in layers, from the groundwork up to the canopy. And the trick is now to choose one level in which we can zip line across this jungle and still make sense. We could talk about the spatio-architectural components, for which Sloterdijk has now become very famous, the idea of foam cities, the idea of arrangements of space. We could talk about Sloterdijk, the media theorist, which is absolutely fundamental to Sloterdijk. We could draw parallels and indebtedness to McLuhan, to Hitler, and so on. We could talk about Sloterdijk also as on a purely aesthetic vein, which of course is important when we discuss the last part of the Luftbeben essay, where he talks about surrealism. But what I would like to do is to choose a level which is in a way the most compact and which will give you the most load when you walk out of here later. And that is the anthropological level. Now please keep in mind, when Germans use the word Anthropologie, it is as close to philosophy as English anthropology is to ethnology. So we're in a grey zone where philosophy and anthropology rub against each other. And as a matter of fact, Sloterdijk is heavily indebted to a school which branded this particular connection. Let us move in here. If we move on that particular level, we have a couple of stops, 4 or 5 on the way, which will suffice to give an idea of what he's aiming at. We go in on this level, and the first very big tree we bump into, like George of the Jungle, inevitably, is Friedrich Nietzsche. On this particular level, what is important for Sloterdijk in Nietzsche is the idea of a certain human autoplasticity. The idea that we can self-fashion ourselves on a very fundamental level. In philosophical folklore, this is known as the Superman. I do not know what the Superman is. I imagine him to be a kind of a blonde beast with tenure, but I do not know exactly which of they are. But what is important is that Nietzsche is in a way replacing the question, what is man, by where is man? The idea being is that our present state as humans is kind of a rope which is linked upwards and which is something we may traverse upwards to reach a higher level. So there is a plasticity there, a fashionability, an idea of improvement. And Sloterdijk will take this and he will stick to it. So the very first thing you need to keep in mind is this idea of Nietzschean possibility of updrift. However, it is fairly clear that Nietzsche is a very idiosyncratic, highly interesting reaction to the paradigm of evolution as it develops in 19th century in Europe, especially with Darwinian theory. But it still is basically a very traditional approach in as far as it posits a unit of selection, an organism, against a fairly homogeneous background. So we have to go a bit further. So we zip line along, and the next tree we bump into is a man who is mentioned several times towards the end of the text you've read, and that is the Estonian germ biologist Jakob von Uexküll, most famous for formulating the concept of Umwelt. I'm sorry, we have to go into detail here for a couple of minutes, because the word Umwelt is normally simply translated as environment, and that is not what Uexküll had in mind. Uexküll did not invent the term. The term had been around since the very early 1800s. It was invented, it was formulated by a Danish writer who wrote copious German prose. But towards the second half of the 19th century, it came to denote in German something similar to French milieu, as in the milieu of Hippolyte Taine, or as in the novels of Émile Zola, and that is determinating environment. And that is precisely what Uexküll reacted against. He said, no, first of all, if you look at animals, if you analyze animals, you cannot stop at the level of the simple organism which is surrounded by a homogeneous environment which brings in fairly standard stimuli to which the animal responds. Each animal, each species, has its own particular world. It is linked into a symbiotic process in which it only perceives that part of the world which is meaningful to it. But that particular Umwelt is as much part of the animal as the body itself. So now you have the notion of expanding the idea of a subject to a species-specific environment. So no longer do we have this very standard, very crude approach which separates between organism and environment, but now we have something far more subtle. This is the only German grammar lesson I'm giving. In German, the word for adaptation is Anpassung. Etwas passt sich an, something adapts to something. Uexküll replaces the word Anpassung by changing the prefix an, which means to, by the prefix ein, which means into. So he speaks of Einpassung. An organism is fitted into the world in a very, very subtle way. This comes at a great price because Uexküll can no longer wants to explain the evolution, how it came about. To recap, we have in Nietzsche the idea of buoyancy, of German Auftrieb, the idea of rising, the idea of self-fashioning. We now have a more extended idea of a far more complicated sphere which surrounds the organism and which has to be taken into account, because without that Umwelt it makes no sense to talk about it. Next step is a combination of a group of trees here and a very, very, very massive tree here, the biggest tree in the wood. This group of trees here is a cluster of theorists which soon came to be known as the philosophical anthropologists. And unless you are experts, you won't know these people. Many of them have not been translated. Max Scheler, Helmut Plessner, and Arnold Gehlen. And they take their cue from Uexküll to arrive at a very strange, very 1920s mixture of anthropology and biology to come up with a new description of what the human being is. And as has been pointed out, it is difficult to define what the human is in philosophical anthropology, but it is always a certain movement. You now always already link humans in a trajectory which leads from the humans to the environment, from the humans to plants and animals, and from the humans backwards and forwards in time. And so there is this embeddedness in nature with direct philosophical consequences, based on the idea that in a way humans, following Uexküll, can be described like animals. The question now arises, do humans have an Umwelt? Uexküll said yes. And I'm not going to go further here, but those who want to do it, you can read his nice book, A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans, and you can also read my afterword to it, and you can see what strange ideas he came up with when he talks about human Umwelt. But the philosophical anthropologist said, no. What defines the human is, in Plessner's famous phrase, the eccentricality of being. Namely the fact that we are not in the middle of some kind of bubble, that we are eccentric to it, that we are in a way the orphans of creation because we are no longer fitted into anything. And this gave rise very often to an extremely conservative approach, especially in the philosophy of Arnold Gehlen, who had a great career start under the people who were in charge from 33 to 45, saying that you need culture and institutions to make up for the fact that we are no longer at home in nature. So man is by nature a cultural animal because you need the institutions to make up for the decenteredness of the human. At the same time, we've got this massive tree, which of course is Heidegger. You know, I've been struggling on how to deal with Heidegger, or rather Sloterdijk's appropriation of Heidegger. And then I was reading about the Punic Wars. The Romans had this neat habit called evocatio, which is when they're about to storm a city, they performed a ritual to lure out the enemy gods so that they would cross sides over to the Romans to be transported in honor back to Rome and join the Roman pantheon. Famous case is Scipio Aemilianus, before they raze Carthage to the ground, performs the evocatio. The idea being is that if the gods, the enemy gods, have deserted their temples, it no longer constitutes sacrilege when the legions come in and despoil the temples. We still have this ritual today, we call it reception. So you deal with a theory, you first conjure up the gods that are there, and then you declare the rest dead. And in a way, that is what Sloterdijk does with Heidegger. Now, Heidegger's take, as it is developed in the truly magnificent lectures of 1929, where he first talks about boredom and then talks about the various ways in which animals and humans are related to the world, is to, in a way, go backwards and say that there is a fundamental break between humans and animals, in the sense that animals, in his terminology, are poor in the world because they are benumbed and inhibited by the very ring in which they're fitted into, whereas humans are world open. Humans, and one of the consequences of that is that humans can actually recognize things as such with which they interact. A lizard sitting on a stone has no idea of the stone as such. The stone is basically an Obsculian signal, here I can sit. What Sloterdijk now takes from Heidegger is, again, this idea of the openness, and he also takes from him the idea that there's a categorical difference between animals and humans. There's very little about animals at Sloterdijk. But what is most important is, and here we're slowly coming into the gas warfare, is the idea that we are, in the famous phrase of Heidegger, thrown into the world, which puts us in a situation where we have to work at our own preparedness that the world may reveal itself to us. That is the famous concept of unconcealment. Now, let us wrap this together by giving the complete narrative. According to the latest information, though I'm certain this is going to change within the next couple of weeks or so, over the last 7 million years, the world has seen 27 different hominin species. When I went to school, it was still a very, very straightforward business. There was at one point something that climbed around the trees that was called Ramapithecus, then there was Lucy, then there was a couple of homos, and then there was us. If you now look at the charts, you have a bewildering proliferation of species of which you do not know who gave rise to whom, which are concurrent, which are consecutive. But one thing we do know, that is, round about 2 or 3 million years ago, evolution, I'm now anthropomorphizing because it's easier to express it that way, came up with 2 strategies. Basically, it had 2 numbers on which it bet, and those are bowels and brains. On the one hand, you have very robust early hominins who have a long intestinal tract, who are vegetarians, and who basically sit around eating all the time. On the other hand, you have our ancestors who have discovered animal protein and who start eating that, and who, because of that, and because of also other things, are starting to build up their brains. So that in the paleontological rhetoric, they now cross the cerebral Rubicon. Their heads have to get larger. As those of you know, as all of you know, and of course as women know better than men, this is a recipe for potential disaster. Because the upright posture and the growth of the brain do not go together well. The upright posture reconceives the pelvic architecture, narrowing the birth canal, meaning that the only way in which we can give birth is by giving birth too early. which is why mammal infants are by far the most helpless infants there are. They need immediate attention for a very long time. They will not survive. Remember philosophical anthropology? We're back there again. Because we are thrust, ejected into the world too early, something else has to take over. Because Mother Nature abandons us too early, our biological mothers have to take over. And so you develop structures, spheres, in which it is possible to protect what normally would be the selection, the negative selection of babies. And Sloterdijk goes even further and says, further back and says, in a way, this is the continuation of something that started already on a mammalian level, when you have a horde of animals where the weaker individuals are in the middle and the stronger individuals form a wall around them. That is the very beginning of immunizing, of creating a system which is no longer directly under the influence of outside selection. And this is the anthropological basis, the idea of early birth, of neoteny, of the retention of childlike features biologically, of the helplessness of early infants, which then leads on and on to the idea that we are always already encapsulated in what he calls spheres. It is important to realize that a sphere is not you in the middle and something around. That is dead wrong. When he speaks of spheres, he has in mind a kind of an ellipse where you and your other are the two focal points. The other may be, in your very early stage, the amniotic fluid. It may be the placenta. It then may be your mother. It then may be your significant other, and then later when you grow up and you transfer this early dyadic union into the world, it may be somebody you follow. So we are always already in these spheres which are originally dyads, which can expand to further. So the very first number in Sloterdijk's philosophy is never one. It never started with one. It is always the number two, which cannot be deconstructed. And from this follows a philosophy of history in which we are constantly trying to recreate these microspheres in which we originated on a macrospheric, that is, political level. The idea of the sphere as the ideal geometrical figure which we should strive to emulate and which is how the world apparently is organized. It is important that this is not just a biological drive, it is much more. It is also a philosophical drive and an epistemological drive. Remember what we said about Plato and starting philosophy. When was this? Well, after Athens lost the war. So Athens had revenge on the world by sending out its philosophers to make up for the lost victory against the Spartans. It is the idea to create human beings who are mobile enough to now interact in this larger Hellenic sphere that will be inaugurated by Philip and by Alexander. It is quite literally a breeding of minds that reconfigures the human. And the most important point comes now. This process, which in the beginning is obviously not understood, the unborn fetus does not interact as a subject with the placenta as an object, because there's no subject, there's no object, there's only, in Thomas Macho's word, an object, which is an object shadow perceived by something which is not a subject. But the most important thing is that everything I've been talking about until now, especially in the 20th century, is now made explicit. In German, the word is explizieren. It is sometimes translated as explicate, but as I mentioned right in the beginning, the correct term is explicitate. To make something explicit. And this is, in a way, a technological update of what Heidegger called entbergen, to unconceal. We are now at a stage where all our enabling environments, where all these old spheres are now being understood and implemented and technologically realized. But they were first done so in the 20th century at Ypres, meaning that here it was the destructive knowledge of it that gave rise to understanding. First you had the gas attack, first you had the gas chambers, and then you had the idea of air conditioning. What Sloterdijk is doing is, like Friedrich Kittler to a certain extent, he is updating, technically updating, to be very precise, anthropotechnically updating the philosophies of Nietzsche and Heidegger by saying, A, we no longer have to wait, as Heidegger would have it, for the gods to come or for being to reveal itself to us. We are thrown technically into the world. Our species arose from throwing, and that is the very first way of creating an insulating distance from a hostile environment. And we are now in a process where we can actually deliberately conceive of what is going on. And this puts him very much, as I mentioned at the very beginning, in a collision course with more pessimistic philosophies, because there is a fairly serene heiter, in the old sense of the word of Nietzsche, gay science at work here, which is very much opposed against what he would call the miserabilist, better know-it-all attitude of the Frankfurt School. And that is the idea that we actually have this buoyancy, that we are going upwards. The problem, of course, is, as no doubt all of you have realized, he says the most important sciences are immunology and climatology, but precisely those are the sciences which give us a very bleak outlook because the things are going to bits. So precisely at a time when we are in desperate situation, he comes up and says, actually, this should give us hope. How these two go together, I don't quite know, and it's one of the weakest points of his philosophy. Let me come to the end with applying this to the gas war essay. The idea is, not unlike Hitler, that you have an explicitation thrust brought about by war. It is the scientific analysis of the vulnerable enabling environments that allows for a qualitative change in warfare, which is given the name terrorism by Sloterdijk. And he makes no distinction between this military endeavour and then the allegedly non-military endeavours of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, or the thermal terror of the bombings of Dresden, or the nuclear terror of Hiroshima. It is this thrust of explicitation which is then picked up by the conscious move towards designing climates. Most trivial example are air conditioning. And then he says that there is a very direct correlation to this on the artistic level, and that is for him surrealism, and that is the attack on the everyday enabling environment by the surrealists to suddenly shatter your blind trust into that which sustains you. Personally, I would have preferred to talk about the formalists, because they are probably the very first who say that you have to break habits of perception to analyze what basically your enabling perceptions are. But you have here a clear parallelism between the technical expectation and the artistic expectation. In short, then, in the famous posthumously published Spiegel interview, there's this Heidegger quote, that only the gods can save us. Well, what Sloterdijk has done to a certain degree is he has, like the Romans, saved the gods. He has evoked them out of Heidegger's theory onto his side and presented what is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting updates of something that amalgamated in the 1920s and which also takes on and furthers, and in very strange way twists, the cultural inheritance of the 1960s which shaped him. Thank you for your patience.
Before Geoffrey fields as many questions as he likes, it just falls upon me to say very quickly, this is an art gallery, and bookstore, and we had some problems early on with people walking away with books. So you know, all the books in the front are for sale, and Kate's working the desk if you want to purchase them. So FYI on that. So shall we do some Q&A? Just raise your hands.
Looks like a chemical experiment, doesn't it?
We're explaining the concept of Umwelt using the homes analogy. My original understanding was that the Umwelt was particular to the object, in the sense that it would be each person or subject would have their own, not that it would be a shared Umwelt of the species. So I'm these days thinking a lot about humanism. So I'm curious if this is a kind of humanism. Do you understand my question? That Umwelt is a species shared around.
Okay. Let's stick with Uexküll himself. Once again, the basic thrust of Uexküll is a very anti-Darwinian move, which wants to do away with this blind, as he calls it, English idea of the two-step of variation and selection. He thinks that this leads to an inhumane treatment of animals and nature, because we believe that there's this one outside force, which is the epistemological equivalent of gravity, which acts on all organisms in the same way. So Umwelt is first of all an attempt to differentiate environment by species. Now,
to differentiate environment
by species. Each species has a species-specific Umwelt.
Right.
And Umwelt has to be used in the German sense so as not to confuse it with the average term environment. For that, in Uexküll's language, you've got the German word Umgebung. All of these markers in Umwelt are significant markers, that is something which is perceived by the organism, by the species, and into which it is involved in a semiotic feedback. This does not involve the material enabling environments like air. That Uexküll clearly does not say. You got a lot of flack for that. Now, with humans, very briefly, the problem is that Uexküll wrote a lot. And the more he wrote, the more strange the application to humans became. Because here, you first of all have the idea that each individual human has their own Umwelt. So he says, Mr. Meyer has an Umwelt where he only sees Meyer things, which Mr. Schultz does not see. This is almost a verbatim quote. But then he says, not only do humans have, individuals of humans have Umwelt, nations have their own Umwelt. That's why the English are obsessed with Darwin's and the morally upright Germans are not, because Darwin is not a moral marker for the Germans. Then he comes up with the idea that regions have their Umwelt. Like Neapolitans are the happiest people because they constantly experience the Umwelt every day anew. And then he comes up with the extremely dangerous fascist idea that professions have their Umwelt, which is why if you are a cobbler's son, you should be a cobbler, like your father, because you've already grown up with species-specific markers. This is not so much a humanism in the sense that it posits some essential nature. This is a differentiated idea of, for animals, species-specific, and for humans, very different levels of centric Umwelts. And that is difficult to explain quite simply because it never makes it into a statement. Yeah?
Just because doesn't Husserl talk about life world? Mm-hmm. Is the definition of Umwelt, or maybe I'm wrong?
No. There are various concepts which pop up at several times. There's the life world, there's the Umwelt, there's Wilke's Weltinnenraum, which is somehow related to... No, this is not phenomenological. So there's something very, very different. In philosophical tradition, Uexküll believed that he was a follower of Kant. In my opinion, and the opinion of people actually know greater more than I, that's just complete nonsense. He didn't understand him. But he thinks that his idea of Umwelt is in a way an extrapolation of the fact that according to Kant, you can only see things to a certain grade. But that is very, very far removed from Husserl. Remember, not to go too much into Husserl, some of the ideas Husserl has is the following, and that is that we will now conduct a big purging of the world in the sense that we will analyze the way our consciousness always already is enmeshed in our perception. If we understand how our consciousness works, we can subtract it, and then the negative result will be the thing as we should see it. That is something which is completely at odds with anything that people would say in terms of order. So no, I know it looks a bit similar, but it's not.
Sounds like horizon, just to follow up on that. Horizon is used in Heidegger.
Yeah. What in the definite word, to quote Sloterdijk, the deepest and most trivial word in Heidegger is world. And he once makes a pithy remark, his sphere is an attempt in slightly poetic language to find the middle ground between Heideggerian Welt and Uxkündigen Umwelt. To take from two and to combine them in a middle position, which is philosophically and anthropologically and anthropotechnically feasible.
Can I just, so there's an intentionality to it between, because you said that it's a sphere, it's not that there's a self and then some sort of tether to another.
No.
So, but in a certain sense, the sphere bends back on itself for all of those involved in it.
Yeah. It is very important that he does not want to simply have the idea of extending the subjective environment. The spheres start categorically with the number 2. It is not just you. It is you as one focal point in an ellipse with something else there. That is the initial sphere. And he's very, very clear on that. Everything which would put these together or leave only one in the middle is anathema to Sloterdijk. So we have to be very clear on that. So there is you always already in a dyad with your shadow other, whatever that may be. It can be extended in number, but that's how it starts.
This, I really don't have a read on this sort of line of the conversation, but I know Hegel pretty well. And so I'm trying to figure out how this isn't dialectic, in a way, or how he differentiates himself. With maybe putting an emphasis on the alpha, even in terms of what might differentiate him from other Hegelians. Although you're not saying he's a Hegelian. And even in the sense of like maybe trying to compare him to Marx, or what Sloterdijk is saying, this theory of the air, kind of the idea of the commodity and us having to pass through the commodity form for so that certain social relations are kind of like rupture or generalized so that we can have a true philosophy of universal values that we can then become responsible for. Like this seems to be the sort of like theory of the gas to the, and so I'm wondering, and then I'm all over the place here, but you're talking about, let's say, how are reification or concretizierung in German different from explication, as the way you're pointing out, and how Marx is using them too? Because all of these terms, they just seem so similar to me, and I'm just wanting to know how to differentiate.
Okay, let's start with Hegel. That's an optimistic statement. It is very tempting to draw a direct parallel in view of the fact that we appear to have a process, a grand historical process, which first involves things somehow happening unconsciously and people not aware of it, and then subsequently people understanding what is going on. On a very, very, very general level, obviously there are connections there, but then there would be connections with many other people too.
Yeah.
However, there is no sense of dialectics there. It is, much as in the case of Heidegger, you have, if you want to use the word history, a regime of certain instances of unconcealing which cannot be subsumed under A, dialectics, or B, an absolute subject or absolute spirit going through there. Here Sloterdijk is very close again to Hitler. Kittler says we have to update the history of being of Heidegger discontinuously by looking at changing technologies which make explicit what being is about. Sloterdijk does much the same. We have here various impositions on the world, first reflexive, then more ideological, and later with technical explication, but that does not fall under a dialectic relationship, that does not fall under any absolute subject doing it. That also would, to a certain degree, go against Marx. However, the idea of reification, in German normally Verdinglichung, this is an interesting point because, of course, Verdinglichung, reification, especially in capitalism, where it is done not with the clear idea of what you're doing, presents itself with Sloterdijk very early on. This will be in the second volume of Spheres, which is called Globes, with the European reach across the world. That is, however, much closer to what Heidegger would see the world as an image than the actual reification of the world. So you have the idea that the world is an image into which we project ourselves, and the world becomes this Jules Vernean space where we travel along as projectiles. That form of reification is clearly there, and that, Sloterdijk would say, is the consequence of the imposition of a macrosphere on the world, which starts with Greek philosophy and which is supercharged with the movement of capital around the world, especially in the 15th and 16th century, which creates the spirit of enterprise and risk. So with regard to the phenomena analyzed, it is fairly close to Marx. With regard to the undergrowth, it is much closer to Heidegger.
Thank you.
I was just curious about the presence of absence of the undergrowth. I was thinking, again, in this tick, that is sort of waiting for presence, which then is the tick becomes. There's a way of representing, a great way of representing that kind of absence that's sort of
the tick, Uxkud's tick is now, there's this famous menagerie of philosophical animals. You've got Maturana's frog, and you've got Uxkud's tick, and Flusser's squid, and all that. The tick is just such a beautiful example because the entire world consists of free markers. And the idea of absence and presence of Uxkud is a functional cycle where the organism realizes something, then it leads to an effect, and at that point the first realization of Marx's sign disappears. So there's a constant flickering of absence and presence in what is basically a Helmholtz world of ongoing functional cycles. This would not be the case so much in Sloterdijk. It would be only the case if you want to expand it very large, and that is, and again this would sort of have Hegelian reminiscence, that is the falling away, the silencing of the old stereological projections which no longer apply. But the tick is this beautiful example. If you ever want to explain what Uxkud is about, the tick always does it, and Agamben does a beautiful job with it. Yeah, Rob.
So the idea of like manufacturing climates, I guess, or making climates, and coupled with this idea that that humans have kind of been abandoned by Mother Nature in their own sphere, or I guess like put together those ideas, especially in our times, seem to suggest that there's not really any hope of reversing like the manufacturing of the global climate in a destructive direction. Because the idea that humans have abandoned Mother Nature kind of suggests that they can't back off on that and let Mother Nature kind of sort herself out. So I'm wondering if, well, and even like the idea of air conditioning too is kind of interesting, because the accidental, with the original air conditioning, the accidental kind of outcome of that was like CFCs and stuff like that, and kind of this, it's not really a very clean or effective process. Even the gas is like wind, kind of blows it around. You can't quite get it right. So I guess I'm wondering if Sloterdijk sees this as kind of like an ahistorical human trait, or whether it's a 20th century thing, whether there's potential to change that, whether like Mother Nature can play a role and kind of reclaim part of the climate or the environment, or whether it's kind of just like a haphazard making of climates and kind of see where it goes and hope for the best.
Well, a couple of things around. In a way, you've got all the ingredients for your own answer. Let's start. One of the great terms put forward by philosophical anthropology is the term by Arnold Gehlen, which he robbed or stole surreptitiously from Herder a couple of hundred years earlier, and that is the human is a Mängelwesen. That is a deficient being. It is signified by lack. Because we are born too early, because we are what in good anthropological German is called instinct entsichert, we are no longer secured by instincts, because we're no longer fitted in, because we're no longer clearly adapted, we are deficient. And now, Sloterdijk comes up with exactly the same analysis that changes the diagnosis. It's like the old one, half full, half empty. Gehlen looks at us and says, wow, we are only half there, this is not going to lead anywhere. And Sloterdijk says, hey, we've still got halfway to go. So, what Gehlen calls Mängelwesen, Sloterdijk says we are, I think this is the English translation, luxuriating beings, luxurierende Wesen. That is, we are always already going up by buoyancy, by going upwards. That is the first point. Now the second point, you're absolutely right. This is a point which is actually addressed better by Bruno Latour than by Sloterdijk. And that is that what are we going to do now when precisely that science, which has been so involved in explicitating our environment, also shows us that we're slowly going to bits. So there's this new book which says that we're only going to survive if by the year 2050 there are 500 million humans left. Normal projection says there will be 9 billion. Where did the 8,500,000 go to? And it would be normally a signal for great pessimism. We have gone far beyond our inability not to luxuriate, has actually created a world in which we are faced with one of the paradoxes of modernity, and that is, at precisely that moment where our explicitating understanding of our own past has opened up possibilities of action, our own future has closed them down. Because we are, like the mouse in Kafka's fable, running between ever-increasing walls to be eaten by the cat. Sloterdijk is not that pessimistic, though I don't follow him here. Personally, I'm a bit more pessimistic than him there, but he says it is precisely our luxuriation, our buoyancy, which would allow us actually to create new environments, to think far more freely, to make new Anthropocene islands in the world, which would actually help us survive and indeed increase the livability of the world. That is, we now have to become managers of the potential of enabling environments. So he is certainly not pessimistic there. Although, just between you and me, I think this is a bit what the Germans call Pflichtoptimismus, obligatory optimism, because on the one hand he keeps saying, I've got this serene science, so you can't suddenly go all party pooper when it comes to climate change. So he says, no, there are possibilities there, but of course it requires the management of now fairly explicit levels of climate awareness and climate potential.
So he's kind of saying we can air condition everything.
We can, if we do, we can create environments which our ancestors could only dream of. We can actually, if we are responsible, it is not necessary, it is indeed impossible for us to follow what some more pessimistic experts say, that we have to cut down by 70%. He says this is not going to happen because that is against the natural buoyancy. We go upwards. We are not going to go downwards. To expect otherwise is complete blindness, anthropologically and politically. Yeah, Steve.
Well, and so that leads exactly in the question, in the direction of my question. Sloterdijk always reminds me of a cross between Aristophanes and the Symposium, with the two halves forming a whole, and the Teletubbies, precisely because of this buoyancy. And so I'm often wondering, how seriously does he actually mean this concept of spheres and this belief that humans will survive no matter what? So I'm interested first in your view of how Sloterdijk sees his own rhetoric. When you said just now it seems to be a sort of forced, this optimism, I agree with you, but there's also something quite grotesque about that at certain moments. And then, on the other hand, I was relieved to hear you say you don't quite follow him in that regard. So I wonder, how do you respond to this tone in his work? It just seems so blatantly stoned and so blatantly exaggerated. Before you started, you said these people thrive on exaggeration. There's no question he does that. But it seems to me he goes quite so far into ridiculousness that it's very hard to take some of these points seriously.
To misquote, or to extend on the quote by Dorothy Parker, Sloterdijk is not to be laid aside gently. He is to be either embraced or tossed with great force. Let's take this seriously, Steve, for a moment. Spheres is rhetorically, quite apart from quantitatively, the most over the top of all the books, if you exclude the novel that's Salvador and other things. But there is something there where he's very serious, and that is that he is, although he rarely mentions him, and that is one of the very, very few cases where Sloterdijk does not fully acknowledge indebtedness, he is very much in the line of Hans Blumenberg's idea of absolute metaphors. An absolute metaphor is a metaphor like the Platonic cave, that is, metaphors which are so strong that they actually improve upon concepts and can actually guide concepts. So the idea of spheres is clearly partly poetic, but it is, much like the human being itself, arranged on a ladder which is designed to bring you upwards. This he means very seriously, and that is, I will not buy into philosophically rhetorical self-justification. I will come up with these almost metaphors in order to stretch things a bit. There is, of course, also a bit of performative in it there. Steve, you know far better than me that when Heidegger talks about the word Lichtung, then that is also an ontology. That is, the clearing is a term which not only describes something, but which in itself performs what it describes. To a certain extent, this is what Sloterdijk is trying to do too. So sometimes it is clearly over the top, sometimes it is provocation. I think that he is sometimes insufferably self-dramatic when he builds up the scandal surrounding his wonderful speech into a scandal of epic proportions. But I think that he is, I do follow him along on the rhetoric because A, it is very well known, and B, I do buy into the idea that you need these absolute metaphors to stretch. It is basically putting concepts through a boot camp. I go along with that. Basically, yes, of course, there are instances where it doesn't work.
I don't know if I'm totally up to the field here, but as you were talking all the time, I was actually thinking about Dante. At the very end of my comedy, when he talks about the spheres and how they are embedded in one another, and the model that you were drawing was very similar to that as a metaphor for. I mean, it just sounds exactly.
You are absolutely on target. In the second volume of Spheres, there is a very, very good chapter on Dante. And it is, this is a subtle point, a very interesting point, it links Dante to the great systems theorist Niklas Luhmann. His take on Dante is that Dante's hell is a depiction of spheres where the spheres become monadic. That is, the hell is not being pinched by a couple of devils or being running around with somebody burning up the insides. It is that you are enclosed in your own immune system so completely that there's no contact anymore. So what the anti-spheres of hell are that what happens to spheres if it descends into subjective or monadic loneliness. So you are absolutely right. He would be very happy. He would say, read my second book. So there is you can look forward to it. There's a nice chapter on him because he compares the spheres of Dante to Luhmann's social systems, the complete self-enclosure of functional systems which no longer let anything directly in but process anything according to their own properties. And that is negative in Dante, and the production of coldness, which is at the center of hell, is then the metaphorical equivalent of the breakdown of any contact.
That's fascinating. I actually had another question too, because I was trying to figure out how the notion, I was also thinking about Foucault, that's another thinker that was coming to mind as you were talking, and his understanding of hegemony, as with my understanding of Foucault's idea of hegemony is actually a bunch of spheres that are constantly coming together and falling apart and colliding and in constant endless motion. And then adding to that, I was also thinking about Haber. And because you're talking about that, 1915, and the fact that the First World War was actually extended by 1 year, 2 years longer, because of the discovery that Haber made of being able to draw nitrogen out of the atmosphere and created a deadly gas. But at the same time, it also made possible the Green Revolution, which, got rid of hunger for a lot of people on the planet. And then, of course, the Green Revolution started creating problems. And this endless, if I may dare to use the word dialectic, between destruction and construction, this drive, the death drive and the desire that constantly fuels both. So, I mean, I'm just kind of throwing all these out there because they seem in some way to be there, but without, so I'm just wondering how you...
I can quickly respond to Foucault. When you read the normal intellectual biographies of Sloterdijk, it is always said that he burst on the scene in the early 80s with the critique of cynical reason. To this day, it is the most widely sold German book in philosophy, and that's when he arrived. For those who are long enough in the tooth to know, his actual arrival was 10 years earlier. He was still very young then, with an absolutely masterful essay on Foucault. It is way before anybody else received Foucault, and it is a very, very good analysis, which is completely beside all the extremely difficult and volatile reception of so-called post-structuralism in Germany. It is a very, very good essay. And just to back up your point, you are absolutely correct that the notion, especially in the third volume of Spheres, where he talks about all these little honeycomb societies and honeycomb spheres next to each other, is to a certain extent also informed by Foucault. It is one of the more interesting of the many problematic German receptions of so-called French post-structuralism. No.
Maybe you've addressed a couple of these points. I missed those at the beginning. The first thing I wanted to bring up was about Pythagoras, because it seems like he has a very intricate idea of the spheres and like you in relation to one sphere, which is related to another sphere, such as the cosmos, and his, I guess, solution in some ways to this relating to the spheres would be like something to do probably with a movement of the spheres, like this quote, the harmony of the spheres, and in that sense it's like a kind of an alignment and a harmony of moving with the spheres, and that, to me, that seems like sort of some kind of solution to what you're getting at. And then I also wanted to bring up the point about Yanni, who you're talking about Yanni, of the humans are born Yanni. But the other hypothesis for that reason is because they evolved to be evolutionarily more cute. And babies are vulnerable, actually, because it's beneficial for them, because it's like they're cuter, we want to take care of them. And then this kind of places the emphasis on it being actually an aesthetic idea. So this relationship with sphere and making kind of recreate this kind of this relationship, like you were saying, in some sense, possibly whether it's actually aesthetic.
Pythagoras, it is not a solution to the sphere problem. For the simple fact that what you have in Pythagoras, what is continued later, is an idea of geometrically beautiful arranged spheres around the center or around an abcenter that then in many increasingly subtle ways move into each other. But again, you have the idea of something going around and something in the center. So it is the macro-spherological projection of this very beautiful sphere, which is aesthetically to be appreciated, but which does not fit the notion of what he describes as spheres. It is an externalization, but it is an externalization as a slightly dangerous aesthetic construct, which is interesting from an anthropological point of view, but which is not the same, even on a different order of magnitude, as the spheres, he says. With neoteny, you're absolutely right. You can say that the cuteness of babies is evolution strategy to make the mothers more interested in it. That fits in. You are absolutely right, it's aesthetic. Sloterdijk would say, of course, nature herself is luxuriating, and aesthetics is part of this. It is a simple proof, well, not a simple, but it is a very fundamental proof that nature experiences, experiments with the aesthetic dimension to create connections. Absolutely. So this is not simply only related to the human, this is related to evolution as such. It's a beautiful example for the aesthetic surplus which may or may not be utilized at a later date or understood or explicicated. John?
I've got two questions. I think they're related. The first one is about the critique of cynical reason, or the relationship between what you're saying, between spheres, I suppose, and that. Because you're suggesting that here, explicitation is. What's the relationship between explicitation and cynicism? I guess that's it. You know, cynicism is also a form of revelation, but which doesn't entail any sort of optimism or progress or anything like that. We know how, gee, that takes this, we know, but still. And in Critique of Cynical Reasons, I recall, it's been a while since I read it, he instead, as cynicism is a much more sort of Dionysiac, sort of irreverent approach is what he suggests. And then the second, so that's the first thing. And then the second question strikes me, I'm trying to sort of put my finger on what. I thought your presentation was fantastic, it was masterful, and so on and so forth. But I suppose I guess my worry is it's insufficiently cynical then, in that sense. Or whether it's a very Sloterdijkian. You're showing the Umwelt, as it were, of Sloterdijk and this particular German tradition, or set of German traditions and so on, their relationships with their own particular environments, and so on and so forth, very sort of, I suppose, respectful, whereas, and then you say you either embrace him or you toss him off. But isn't there another way of doing it, which I suppose is the more French way, right? Just make a running at you, a raid into intellectual territory and pull out what you want to, if you put it in Sloterdijk's terms as you're explaining it, you bring these thoughts and concepts into your own Umwelt and start doing your own thing with that. But that doesn't seem to be the way that you're going about things at all.
Two things, John. With regard to the Critique of Cynical Reason, very quickly, the entire explicitation in the Spheres project is far more technically involved as it ever was in the earlier books. There is really a clear break in the 1980s. What, of course, is retained is the Dionysian irreverence. You can now recode Dionysian as luxuriating. You can see this Dionysian imagery which he develops early on as a kind of a fairly barbaric early appearance of what later becomes the excess and the surplus, which is now anthropotechnically already there. So there you can draw lines. With regard to the second one, this is a very interesting question, because normally I'm accused by my German colleagues in Germany of doing exactly the opposite. Number one, I did bring up the evocatio thing precisely because that is how you should deal with Sloterdijk. This is a big, big Carthaginian city, raze it to the ground, take out what you want. The other thing is, and that is what I've been trying to do with Hitler, but the problem is, in an audience here, the first thing in mind is to contextualize where the person comes from. I've spent over a decade trying to contextualize Hitler because reception processes are very often truncation processes. And that is, you break off certain points, you go to the fault lines of the theories, you take out certain things. So for Sloterdijk, you can see that already happening now. And for me, it was important just for a moment to go into an old-fashioned mode and say, enthusiastically engage, give the Umwelt, and then we can sit down in the discussion and say, nah, 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 nah. But for my presentation, for me it was clear, first bring the context. Bring the context in a way which may be too enthusiastic, but which is also a mimicry, a mimesis of the theory itself, and then start taking it apart. So I'm quite happy that you bring it up now, because that is what should happen.
Maybe I'll follow up on that from a perspective that may be too respectful as well as too pedestrian, but I haven't heard anyone quite ask this question yet. I'm trying to put this Umwelt idea into the context of kind of the grand history of German particularist ideas, Kultur ideas, and going back to Herder, because Sloterdijk does evoke him twice, not only the Mengelwesen, but also children of the air, right? And the borders of our world being the air, the green, and all of that. I wonder how to connect the Sloterdijk Umwelt with those kind of 18th and 19th century ideas about Weltanschauung as kind of a more ideological and intentional interpretation of the world versus like the Ansicht as something that's kind of prior and more unconscious and more connected to the air that you breathe, the language that you speak, these kinds of things. Wow. Sorry, I know it's big.
No, in a way it brings up a point that John already raised, and in a way I can answer your question, and it will be a follow-up for the explicitation of the answer I gave to you. Reception processes are very often processes where, in the act of transferring theories, the people at the other end zero in on the fault lines of the theory. I'll give you two quick examples and then give you a big example. The reception of Friedrich Hitler has been to isolate his middle period, his media-theoretical period, and to translate all of that, and to leave out what he did before, and to not translate the whole Greek stuff he did later. So you have, in a way, a chocolate bar. You have thicker pieces, then smaller pieces, and you break it up into thin pieces and take out the middle. The reception of Niklas Luhmann has been the exact opposite. You have a very close reception of his epistemological superstructure, the whole observer thing, but there's practically no reception of the historical stuff underneath. So it's like a chocolate wafer. So if you deal with 10-year-olds, they don't eat it like that. They take off one, then they lick off one layer, then they take off it, and that is the reception. Now, a far more famous and far more important example, and one that goes straight to the matter, is the German reception of Darwin. Please keep in mind that at the heart of Darwinian theory are two ideas so conjoined that we now think that they belong together automatically. And that is the idea of the transformation of species, and that is the dynamic by which it comes about, namely variation and selection. But there's no reason why the two things should go together. This was my very first flight in the United States, sitting next to two American fundamentalists from Wichita. And so we were discussing evolution, and I was bringing up, being naive, believing that going down O'Hare runway could actually convert people by bringing up the idea of the moths, which had assimilated and become darker in industrial England. And they said that we're not denying that. We're just denying that the moths turned into something else. Far more important is the other way, and that is you can have transformation of the species without this mechanism, by positing internal forces, orthogenetic, vitalist, call them what you want, which unfold the various species over time. This is particularly prominent in Germany. Why? And now comes the answer to your question. It is a very, very broad answer, which really it is a sketchy answer. That is that, of course, it collides, it goes with the German experience of having a culture, of having a communicative infrastructure without the nation yet, which is constantly being buggered from the outside. So, of course, you posit these internal things against the external environment. So the very first idea is that there are very clear collective socio-historical experiences at work in the denial of this two-step paradigm in Darwinian theory. And even Sloterdijk, with certain anti-Darwinian arguments, even Sloterdijk, when coming up with biologically stupid statements that if the young are protected by the larger members of the herd in the middle, that this does away with the natural selection process, is still playing this game. Luhmann, of course, is playing this game by saying that Darwin doesn't cut it, you need internal systemic trajectories. So the answer to your question is there is a very, very clear intellectual umwelt which goes back to the late 18th century and which was first posited to a certain extent in the really, really radical and extremely original writings of Cadell, who of course is, next to all what you said, in a way the first theoretician of culture, culture as enclosed entities.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about some of the vanishing mediators of Sloterdijk's discourse, and the word explication or explicitation. You know, my reading, because I don't have access to the German, I don't speak German, but it seems to me that, you know, as with Lacan, explication, it has these two commingled aspects to it. There's the semantic aspect, to explicate is to explain, and then there's a kind of force dynamic aspect, unfurling, more and more quickly, unfolding, explicare from the Latin. And you know, with this, you know, account of this rapid-fire reciprocal relation between, on one hand, our understanding, our awareness of our sensitivity to our environment, on one hand, and our ability to transform it, on the other, the culmination point is almost unavoidably this disoriented, neuroticized state, to which is a huge drive dimension. I agree with that one over there. And you know, in an excerpt I read from the third volume of his series where he talks about the honeycombs, apartment dwelling, egospheres, it also has a similar kind of trajectory. It has this intensely, densification has this intensely neuroticizing impact on the human sensibility in a seemingly irrevocable way. Then, if you counterpoise that against some of his discourse in You Must Change Your Life, which I just read, it seems to me like the gist of what he's getting at is, yes, you know, these things have their implacable momentum, but there's a way in which, and this kind of connects a little bit with John's talk the other week, in which, by way of ascetic procedures, subroutines, we can take control of all this momentum and channel it in a more productive or efficacious or just imaginative way that's more agentive. I just wondered if you could speak to that. Especially if my reading is way off, because, like I said, I don't have access to the German. And I read what you said, explicitation. I thought, oh God, I wonder if it doesn't even have resonance with explication the way that I thought it did.
I'm just trying to detect what exactly is the question. That Steve brought up the question of Sloterdijk's rhetoric. Steve, you will agree that the last three books, including the books that mentioned, and of course the Muster Leben ändern, are in rhetoric very different from Spheres. It is now more professorial, more academic. It is far less hyperbolic than the Spheres book. And this has to do with the fact that these are books there to teach people. That's the first thing. So there really is a change in linguistic register and giving, and stylistic register, and giving how important this register is for Sloterdijk. It is an important new way of addressing the problem. Number two is, and this goes back to the debate we had before, the emphasis on repetition, on iteration, and on recursion, though I'm not quite certain that I understand what on earth Sloterdijk means by recursion. This emphasis on the new aesthetic routines, of course, are not quite completely manageable with the other emphasis on the luxuriating life and individual. I cannot bring it together. I think that what you have now is that with the change in stylistic register, you have in a way a more Puritan theory that is slowly succumbing to the temptation to say, curtail yourself, keep yourself under control, and discipline yourself, but discipline yourself upwards. Because in the background there's still Nietzsche. Do not discipline yourself downwards to the status of a slave. Discipline yourself upwards. So that is the two riffs I will have on what you're saying.
This idea of buoyancy, to me, it sounds sort of teleological. And when I think of evolutionary theory is not teleological. So it seems like, I mean, there's a big disconnect there.
No, it is not teleological. There is no telos there. It is quite simply a trajectory. Just as you could say, have a long argument whether evolution or not produces more or less complexity, this is quite simply, one is that it is going upwards, but there's no predetermined goal. In fact, if the term recursion makes any sense at all, there's not allowed to be any predetermined goal there. It is quite simply a basic dynamic which is ideally unidirectional, that is vertical, but it is not teleological.
If it's going up, it be getting better if it's not teleological. It seems that maybe it's not a telos as one would like naively imagine it as a steady image of where we're going to go. We're all going with the spaceship, but things are getting better and we're going upwards and it's going to get more luxurious.
But the idea is precisely not that it is necessarily getting better. The idea is that the upward movement creates possibilities for getting better, but at the same time it creates possibilities for greater destruction. So it is, in a way, when he uses the word upwards, it is a rhetorical formula very much along the line that it is, we should avoid any miserablism, any negativity, any, including, of course, Frankfurt-style depression theory, by focusing on this vertical movement. Of course, it is precisely the vertical movement that opens up possibilities of increased destruction.
Shall we go to the bar?